In this lesson, we are going to be loading country information. So creating a mini application that's going to load the country information using the REST Countries EU API. So it's an open API. And what it does is it allows you to load a lot of country information. So there's a lot of information contained within the object response. And it is suggested that as you're building the application, access some of the different content and build out your own version of the application. So the one that we're going to be demonstrating in this lesson is going to load all of the country information and then chunk it into blocks of 10 countries per page. And it gives you some brief information about the country, the population, the flag, the name, the currency. And you can click through and check out any of the countries that have been loaded. And also the exercise is going to demonstrate how we can save requests, making multiple requests to the page when we load all of the page information directly into one object that's going to be stored within the JavaScript, and then we can break apart the page contents separately, and this is all done with JavaScript. So there's one initial fetch request that's done to the API. Connecting to the REST Countries.eu API, so there's a lot of information contained within this API. This is the endpoint that we're going to be using. So it's REST Countries.eu/rest/v2/all. So returning back all of the available data. And there's more information and documentation over at the website. So different endpoints that you can connect to. You can select by country as well. You can select by full name, code, list of codes, currencies, and all of this information that can be retrieved back. So going into the editor, we've got the standard HTML template that we've been using. So including several different elements on the page. So the H1, the input, the button, the output area, and then we're linking over to the script source. And this is where we've copied over some of the content from the previous project. So connecting to the button, connecting to the H1 element, connecting to the output and input element so that we can pick up any information that is input there. Let's also add in the URL, so have the endpoint. So that's going to be the endpoint that we're connecting to. And then to adjust it, we can use the all as a parameter. So we're going to just initially be connecting to the v2 and then adding in all as one of the parameters. So to search for all, we also have the button, the event listener added to the button. So when we click the button, we see ready being output into the console. So from here, let's make our fetch connection. So we'll set up a variable name and call that parameters. So this is where we can enter in the value for the parameters, and that's just going to be all for now. And we're going to also set up our URL. So this can serve as the base URL. And then the final URL is going to take the base URL and concatenate together. So adding in the parameters that we want to make the request to. And then launching the fetch request. And with the first promise, so returning back the response object. And when we get the response object, using the JSON method to return back the actual data. And then once we do get the response, return back the data, and for now we're going to log it out into the console, and then we're going to deconstruct the JavaScript object so that we can output some content on the page. So that returns back quite a bit of information. So there's 250 different elements there that it's returning back. And each one of these has quite a bit of information contained within the object. So let's output the items that are being returned back. So we're just doing a request for all, and we'll create a way to output the content. So we want to loop through the data object. So this is going to be the array that we're looking for. And the array is always indicated with a length. So if you can iterate through it, that means that you can get the length out. So let's create some functions in order to accommodate that. So So it'll be load pages and pass in the data object into the pages, and then within the console we'll output the data and then update this. Instead of console log, we're going to load the pages. So right now it'll do the same thing when we click the button, and we want to iterate through using for each. So looping through each one of the items within the array and then returning back each element that's contained within the array. And from there we can log out the contents of the element. So this should actually be element. And as we look through each one of the objects, we can output and create the country. So the page elements, and we can also call this data. And then this can get passed in as a page element. And now we want to construct some content on the page for each one of these items. And there is a lot of stuff listed here. So what we can do is we can load the data initially and load it into an object that we can group to different pages if we want. So let's create a global page and just have an object here, and then within this object, this can just be JSON and an object sitting with an object. So we'll have an content within the page JSON. So once the content has loaded, we're going to take the page JSON and actually it's going to be page JSON and equal that to whatever we've got in data. And that way when we load the pages, we can just reference the page data. So let's try that and just make sure that's working. So now this object is represented within the page JSON object. And if you clear it and you type in the page object, you can see that we've loaded in this JSON array. And this is just one way that if you're using this data, you can cut down on the number of requests to the server. So some of the APIs will have limits to the number of requests you can make. So this is one way where you can load all of the data within one shot and then make use of the data, so you can divide it up into separate pages if you want. So if you want to create pages from the object, and this will create the pages. And for the global page object, set a value of 1, so it'll start on whatever the first page is. And then how many items we want to have per page, we can divide it up. So if we want to have 10 per page, all of that information is contained. And the reason that I use an object here is that this provides us the flexibility to have it dynamically generate the pages. So if we were to preset it that we want 10 per page and we load all of the JSON object, then we don't have any flexibility to change that. So in order to change the number of items per page, we can easily just update this and change this. So let's construct the page elements, and then we're going to load some pages down below that the user can select from. And then this information, we're not going to make a separate request. We're just going to use the current page JSON object. So initially, we're going to load the content, and then that's going to allow us to create the pages. And then we'll use the load pages to load through and create each one of the page elements. So let's start by chunking the page data. So we're going to send this over to create pages. And then we're going to just load the one page of data. And we don't actually even have to pass anything in here, because we're going to have all of the content listed within the page JSON. As well, we're going to have a page and a page number that we can use. So we're going to have a page and a page JSON with all of the contents. So let's separate out and use the create pages. And one of the easiest ways to create the pages is to load the page JSON content with the data and then construct the pages initially. So what this is going to do is this is going to do a full page load, create the pages that we can interact with on the screen. So we're going to chunk the data that's passed in here into page data. So creating a for loop, let I equals 0. And I'm going to also update this to, instead of JSON, we'll have an array of all of the pages in here. And we can also keep the JSON object as well. So the array will contain all of the page information. And we're going to be able to generate, depending on which array we want to use, that's going to be the pages that we're setting up. So it's going to initially take the page array, and if you want to clear out the contents of an array, you can just set the length to 0, and that will clear any existing content within the page. We've also got the number per page. So let's set that up, or we can count how many pages we have. So with a value of p total for page total. So we'll take the length of the data and divide that by page and the number per page. So that's going to give us a total value. And then we're going to loop through while I is less than the total value and increment I plus 1. And then as we load through, we want to push the data. So we want to chunk the data into the number of pages that we would have within the total. So let's log out the page total value and save that. So when we click it, we're going to have 25 pages total. So as we loop through, we're going to select and we're going to slice the initial array. So that's going to be the data array, and we're going to be appending to or adding to the temporary array. So let's set up a holder. So that will just be the temporary array. And right now that just can be a blank array. And then every time we iterate through the loop, we can set the value of temp array to equal to the contents, the slice of the data. So the data, remember, is going to be the one where we've got the actual data. So using slice and setting the starting point of the slice is going to be whatever the value of I is. And then the ending point, the number of contents that we're going to take, is going to be I plus the page per. So the items per page. And at the end, this will create a temporary array. But what we want to do with the temporary array is we also want to push it into the main array. So within the page array, let's push the temp array into that. And we can console log out the contents of page afterwards. And actually, because this is global, it's assigning the same, it's showing up as the same content. So let's separate out the chunking. So there is a calculation error here, is that we're incrementing I with 1, but we're splitting it up from starting point of I and then ending at I plus per page. So I is only incrementing by 1, but we want to increment I by the value of per page. So let's make a quick update. So instead of looping through and going to the total, we can just separate it out at whatever the data length is. And that will automatically loop through to whatever we've got the end length for it. So that will return back the full 255 entries. And instead of adding just with I, we're going to update I and add the page per. So this will change the value of I. So the starting point of I will be 0 at first, and then the next iteration it will be the I plus the per page value, and that will allow us to chunk it. So let's try that one more time. And now when we look at the results, we've got different results. And when we look at the end arrays, we've got all of the data loaded within the arrays. So we've got all 24 pages or 25 pages broken down within the page array. So that means that we can load the page contents. So when we do the load pages, this function will load the page contents, and we can return back, instead of data, we've got the contents within the page array. and whatever the current page is going to be. So that's the array that we're going to use, and return back the array according to whatever the index value is. So that means that we can loop out and return back each one of the page elements. And then when we want to build them and add them to the page, right now we'll just output them as data. So I know we've got quite a few console messages. So let's comment out some of them. So it's a lot more clear as to what we're doing. And now we're not using the p total anymore either. So click it. And it's outputting the contents that are contained within the first part of the page array. So these are the first set of values. And actually it's starting with a base of 0. So this is the array, it's a base of 0. So that's where we need to add 1 to the page value, or we need to subtract 1 to get the index value. So now it's going to load the content accordingly. So it should load the first set of data, and that's starting with Afghanistan. So let's go take a closer look at this object and take out what we want to output on the page. So let's create another function that's going to create node. We're going to need a parent value and L type, and as well as any HTML content that we want to include in it. So this is just going to be a better way or a simpler way to create the content for the page, where we can pull the information out of the data object that's being outed into the console. So let's create within the main div using the create node method that we just created. And the parent is going to be output. So that's the output page element with a class of output that we're outputting onto the page. So let's clear out the content that's contained within there by using output and then updating the inner HTML of that element. So that's going to clear out the current existing content and allow us to update content into it. So if we want to create a main container, this can be a div, and then the content contained within here, the HTML is just going to be blank. So when we pass the content into there, we can create the temporary element, and using the document create element, and the element type is passed into the function. So that's the element type that we're going to create. And then using the parent object that we want to append it to, and then append the element to the parent. And then for the element, let's update the inner HTML and apply the HTML object information that we've sent into the function. And then lastly, we're going to return back the element object. So this is just a quick way to avoid the repetition of constantly using the document create element to create the nodes, where we can create the one main node, and then within the main node we can set and pull out information from the data object. So let's select the data object and set some content into it. So in this case, we're going to create the title, and using the create node function, appending it to main if we want to have it within a div, and then the contents of the title. So this can be HTML, and we can use the backticks. So this can just be an HTML string. I'm also going to wrap the word wrap, and then using the $, selecting the value, and that's going to be name. And maybe we want to set this as an H2 so that each one of them is going to be distinct. Close off the H2. And the reason I'm assigning variable values to them is I'm also returning the elements. So if we want to apply some styling to the title, we can do that as well. This can just be stats. So now I can take the title element and I can apply styling to it. And if I wanted the color of the font to be red, I can do that. And then within the stats, and let's load it. So now we're loading all of the pages. And this is the second one there that we're creating as stats. So that's why it's still within a black color, because we haven't updated that. So for the stats themselves, let's create, we'll create a variable called HTML1. And then within this is where we can list out all of the stats, and then we'll pass that value into the function. So it makes it more readable. So whatever stats we want to pull out of here, and you can also select different stats as well as needed. So let's add in some of those stats. And if we want to get the population, add the population value into there. And that's going to be within the data population. And then you can add to that HTML. So let me turn it into let. And this way we can add to it. So what other information that we want to pull back, we can add that information in. And so currencies is going to be an array of currencies. If there's only one item within the array, maybe we want to pull up the first item that's contained within the array. So currency. And that's contained within data, currencies, and whatever the first item is within the array. And let's just output the name. And then also if we want the symbol, we can add the symbol in as well. So that's going to add the currency as a separate div. If we want to add the flag, so the flag is an SVG. So maybe even right in the beginning before we add the details, we want to have an image for the flag, or give it a name of flag. And let's use the create node. So creating an image object. We're not passing in any content into the HTML, so we can clear that field. And then for flag, set. So set an attribute and source. And the source of the flag is going to be data flag. So let's see how that looks. And we can get rid of the const there for the HTML1. So we've got the countries being loaded, their flags being loaded, and we can also apply some styling to this. So just use a class of box and width of 80%, margin, set that to auto so it centers it, and text align, how about we center align the text. And for box images, set the max width to 100%, and that will make it responsive within the contents of the parent. Also for the box H2s, let's do a text transform and transform it to uppercase. And we'll see what that looks like. And I do need to still apply to the main object. So main class list add, and the class that we're adding is going to be box. So load it one more time. And that way we've applied the properties to each one of these. And so now we want to load the pages at the bottom so the user can navigate to the other pages. So where we're creating the pages within the function, we're slicing and chunking the data into the array, and then we're loading the page content, and then at the bottom we want to have another function that's going to load. So it's going to load all of the page indicators. So that just can be done right at the bottom. And we're going to just append it to the output. So create another element that we can call the main container. So we'll just use the same format, and it's going to be attached to output. And then we want to loop through all of the page array length. So using for let I equals 0, and then while I is less than the page array length. So that will give us a value, a numeric value, and increment it by 1. So let's construct the page elements at the bottom. And this is just going to be whatever we want for the page clicking. So create the node again. And we're appending this one to the main object. And they can be divs or they can be spans. We're going to be applying a class to them anyway. And then the contents of them are going to be whatever the value of I plus 1 is. And then for the page, and these are just going to be the indicators. So let's use class list and add a class. And the class that we're adding is PGS for the pages. So let's set up the class, add some padding for each one of those, and border. Let's add a border radius for styling. And also for the cursor pointer, we'll set up a cursor pointer. And for the color, set it to white, and the background color, let's set to black. So as we loop through, we've added the class of pages. And then we also want to make these clickable. So add an event listener. And the event listener is going to be listening for a click event. And if the click event happens, then we want to load the next page. So all we need to do is increase or assign the value of the page to whatever the contents of the current I plus 1 is. So it's going to be whatever the page is that we want to click. So I plus 1, and set the page to equal I plus 1, and then we load pages. And that will set up the whole process. Again, we're going to load pages, and we're actually going to load the pagination after we load all of the pages. So let's try it. And now we've got the first listing there. And actually, we need to make these display style inline. So as an inline block. And then we can set width 50 pixels. So that way they're more of indicators. So let's try to go to the last page. And that's going to load the last page of content. I'm going to make the images smaller. So set the width to be 20 pixels, 200 pixels. This is going to be a little bit more readable. So these are all the different page indicators. So if we click them, we can navigate through the pages of content. And we don't have to do any type of page reloads or anything like that. Let's also make some updates to the styling. So text, align, center, align the text. Also apply some padding to these. And margin. So the margin is auto, but for top and bottom, let's add 5 pixels and auto, so we can get rid of that. And also for all the elements, we're going to apply the box sizing and use the border box. And going over to Google Fonts, let's select an interesting font for the Google Fonts. And this, of course, whatever you want to do for styling, it's you can apply styling as needed. So let me load the style, and then also let's apply to the body the font family that we've selected. So let's see what that looks like. And so that's going to load all of the pages. I'm going to update the value within the button and update the text content, pages, and for the input value for now, apply the style and display of none since we're not using it. So now we can just load the pages, and also for H1, let's update the text content and say load country info. So there we go. So we've got the ability to load countries, navigate through the different pages of country information. And also, if we want to indicate which page we're currently on, as we're creating the pagination, the pages, we can check to see whatever the current page is. And if it is, then let's apply some styling to it. So to have a condition to see if page is equal, so 2 equal signs there, to the value of I. And it should be actually I plus 1. And if it is, then we'll take the page and style and update the background color to be red. So it will just stick out. So this is going to be whatever the active page currently is. So if we go to page 5, page 7, 19, 21, and so on, it's loading all of that information. And it's also important to note that we're saving ourselves making multiple requests as we're loading all the page data within one shot. Tasks for this lesson are to connect to the API and try it out, load some of the JSON data back into your application, make requests from the user button to output the JSON on the web page, also dynamically load the content into separate pages, allowing the user the ability to select the content that they want to view, and the page content that they have selected should be displayed to them. So navigation of all of the JSON data within the web page. And then additionally, also output additional information from the web API onto the page.